Yemen is a small, unassuming country in the Middle East, but Yemen is at the heart of many of the conflicts throughout the region. The wars and insurgencies in Yemen have also spilled out into international attacks as nations around the world align with different Yemeni factions. Today, we're learning how Yemen became one of the most war-torn countries in the world, and the dirty tactics that continue to destabilize the country. A long history of division and the First Civil War. Yemen is located at the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, bordering Saudi Arabia and Oman. Yemen's history dates back to the ancient times when the land was inhabited by the Sabians and the Kingdom of Sheba, which is referenced in the three major religions of the region: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. These ancient ties elevate the region for different cultural and religious populations in the Middle East, but despite its importance, Yemen has had an identity crisis spurred by separatists and conquerors. By the turn of the 20th century, Yemen already had a long history of conflict with the Ottoman Empire, which eventually led to the 1905 border agreement, splitting Yemen in two. After World War I, in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and northern Yemen became the Mutawakkalite Kingdom of Yemen, and later the region would be renamed the Yemen Arab Republic. While Yemen and the Ottomans were quarreling, Britain also established a protectorate in the port city of Aden, which lasted until 1967. Afterwards, the city gained independence and became a communist region, and this effectively divided Yemen again into the north and south. The division along communist lines would culminate in the North Yemen Civil War. The northern Yemen forces were supported by Britain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, while the south was backed by Egypt. During the North Yemen Civil War, another major rebellion shook the region. Known as the Aden Emergency, two insurgency groups, the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, or FLOSI, and the National Liberation Front, or the NLF, started riots that evolved into police mutiny and a full-on conflict known as the Battle of Crater. The National Liberation Front was known for its deadly guerrilla attacks against both the British and the FLOSI. NLF's leaders ended up cutting deals with the British to defeat FLOSI, and, in the end, the NLF campaign ended up succeeding, and they drove Britain out of Yemen. After a number of ceasefires and negotiations, war broke out again, but this time in the South Yemen Civil War, which resulted in the leader of the Yemeni Socialist Party, Ali Nasser Mohammed, sentenced to death for treason. Finally, in 1990, the Yemen Arab Republic in the north and the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in the south came together to form a unified government, led by the North's President Ali Abdullah Saleh, with the South's Ali Salam al-Baid taking on the role of Vice President. The civil war in the North lasted 8 years, claiming the lives of over 100,000 people, while the civil war in the South lasted only a little over a week. Yet roughly 5,000 combatants died and over 60,000 refugees were displaced. However, remnants of the NLF regrouped as the Yemeni Socialist Party, which caused more unrest between the North and the South. Saleh drew support from conservative jihad groups, which led to the assassination of politicians in the South. Tensions continued to build until 1994, when another 2-month-long civil war erupted, killing another roughly 10,000 people. Later, in 1999, Saleh got another term as president of the newly unified Yemen to become the first elected president with 96.2% of the vote. Peace in Yemen would not last long, though. Another far more brutal group was brewing in Yemen that would shape the course of the nation to this very day. Terror is born in Yemen. The eastern region of Hadramaut extends into South Arabia, Yemen, and Oman, and it was at Hadramaut that a wealthy family began rising to power with their multinational construction company, the Saudi bin Laden Group. The bin Laden family began influencing the economy and the politics of the Hadramaut region. Eventually, this influence would extend into wider Yemen as well. Born in Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden would rise to power in the region. The assassinations against the Socialist Party in South Yemen were carried out by al-Qaeda insurgents led by Osama bin Laden, who was angered by the US-backed unification of Yemen. In response to the assassinations against Yemen politicians, President Saleh conferred with Saudi's Prince Abdulaziz to confiscate Osama bin Laden's passport. Around this time, al-Qaeda convinced veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War to join the Aden Abyan Islamic Army. Despite the war taking place in Afghanistan, a large number of Yemeni fighters participated in the war after bin Laden's business pressure and political outreach convinced fighters to join the cause. The first major al-Qaeda operation in Yemen occurred the year after Saleh was elected in the year 2000, when al-Qaeda forces launched a suicide attack on the U.S. naval destroyer, the USS Cole, which was refueling at the port of Aden. Other politicians who backed or had ties to bin Laden and al-Qaeda were exiled from the country. These politicians would influence local tribes of South Yemen from the safety of Hadramaut, and they would also recruit more extremist jihadi Islamists. Eventually, the growing movement culminated in the formation of the Southern Movement in 2007. The Southern Movement soon aligned itself with the Aden Abyan Islamic Army to further support an independent southern Yemen. But some members of the movement remained defiant against the terrorist organizations in the region. Yemen splinters again. Al-Qaeda terrorist forces, the Southern Movement, and the Aden Abyan Islamic Army all began waging a dirty war against Yemen and anyone who opposed South Yemen independence and hardline Islamic ideals. In 2008, 6 al-Qaeda militants facilitated an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Yemen, killing 18 and injuring 16 others, including all 6 attackers and 6 civilians. In 2009, 9 separate clashes broke out against checkpoints, military bases, and political headquarters. Protests also erupted into bloody clashes that killed dozens of people that year. Violence continued in 2010, with a bombing in Taiz that killed 19 people, and more attacks were launched against foreign tourists in Yemen. These incidents sparked a crackdown on al-Qaeda that was backed by the British Special Air Service and Special Reconnaissance Regiments. Yemen raided a training camp with the help of U.S. cruise missile strikes, which were officially denied by the U.S. military. Full-scale battles broke out when Yemen military forces attacked the al-Qaeda-controlled cities of Houta, Lordar, and Zinjibar. And protests continued to escalate until 2011, when Yemen followed the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions with their own revolution movement. Over 16,000 protesters took to the streets of Yemen's capital city, Sana'a, as part of the Arab Spring movement. A number of armed conflicts broke out between southern separatists, rebels in the north, and the al-Qaeda-backed insurgents. Revolutionary protesters in 2011 sought to end Saleh's presidential rule, which had been in place for over 30 years. In response to the protests, President Saleh confirmed he would give up power after his term ended to prevent disrupting the democratic system. On February 21, 2012, Vice President Abrabu Hadi won the next election with 99.8% of the vote. Al-Qaeda capitalized on the political turmoil of 2011 with armed attacks on military checkpoints and vehicles. As Al-Qaeda advanced, their forces took the towns of Al-Husn and Jahar, giving them access to a weapons factory, and this led to Al-Qaeda declaring its own jurisdiction, or emirate, in Yemen. Over the next few years, Al-Qaeda represented an ever-growing threat for Yemen. On May 21, 2012, the country's worst attack took place during the country's Unity Day parade rehearsal. It killed 96 people and wounded 200 more. In 2013, al-Qaeda destroyed the main oil pipeline in Yemen, which caused a huge blow to the nation's income. since 70% of Yemen's revenue is made up of oil exports. By early 2014, Al-Qaeda, who are now known as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or ACAP, were pushed back to the region of Hadramaut, and local tribes cooperated with the Yemeni military to stage attacks on Al-Qaeda strongholds. That same year, fighting broke out in the Saada as a Zaidi religious leader rose to power. Hussein al-Houthi was a former member of the Yemen parliament, who gained huge support from various groups in Yemen to create the Houthi rebellion, which would spark the next Yemeni civil war, ongoing today. The Houthi movement's new civil war. The Houthi militants launched a full-fledged attack on the capital city of Sana'a on September 16, 2014. 2 days later, over 40 people had died, and by the 19th, Houthi forces disrupted the television network and stormed the Capitol building. Over the next few days, the Houthi militia continued to take control of the city, including the military headquarters of Yemen. This prompted the Prime Minister of Yemen to resign. Later, the Arabic radio station Al Jazeera announced it had tapped a conversation between former President Saleh and the Houthi insurrectionists, which led to claims that he helped the Houthi forces take the city. Later, in 2014, the Houthi fighters attacked the presidential palace and forced President Hadi to resign along with his entire cabinet, and the Supreme Revolutionary Committee was installed. Soon after the Houthis gained control, they began branching into the south with attacks on governorates in the region. Meanwhile, Yemen's official President Hadi took refuge in Saudi Arabia while the Saudis launched airstrikes. International divisions began to solidify as Iran backed the Houthis. The intervention by two larger countries has led some historians to call the new Yemen civil war a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. By 2015, the fighting entered a new stage as Islamic State fighters, or ISIL groups, began to take up arms against the Houthis, with bombings against mosques in Sana'a. Suicide bombings followed, which led to a brief ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi government, while Oman tried to broker a peace deal. All the while, ISIL fought against all combatants in the region: Hadi's forces, Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, and they also angered the long-standing terrorist group in the region, ACAP. The US began intervening with unmanned drone strikes and a special forces mission to destroy Houthi missiles. The US also targeted ISIL forces with airstrikes. In 2017, Saleh, who supposedly helped the Houthi movement gain power, was targeted with an RPG attack on his vehicle and an ambush at his home. A video was published showing his body with a gunshot wound to the head. In 2018, the South was split once more, as some citizens backed the former Hadi government, while others still fought for independence. The Southern Transition Council was founded to support Southern Yemeni independence, and early in 2018, the STC took control of the city of Aden. In 2020, Saudi Arabia led over 100 airstrikes or raids against Houthi, ACAP, and ISIL forces in Yemen. The fighting in 2022 has been the deadliest in Yemen since 2018, with over 599 civilians killed in January alone. Rebels have continued their ongoing dirty war, with attacks on oil tankers and the international airport in the United Arab Emirates capital, Abu Dhabi. Houthi forces fired rockets at the UAE, but these were intercepted by US and UAE forces. Current standing and aftermath. All of this fighting led to a ceasefire on April 2, 2022. The agreement was brokered by the United Nations to help ease fuel imports and exports, but who knows how long it will last. Present calculations estimate that over 150,000 people have died in Yemen's latest civil war, and over 4 million people have been displaced. Yemen's military is the second largest on the Arabian Peninsula, after the much larger Saudi Arabia. With over 400,000 soldiers, Yemen's military budget is roughly 40% of the total spending by the Yemen government. Because of Yemen's instability and large military force, Saudi Arabia sees the ongoing insurgency in Yemen as a threat to their own national security. Today, Yemen is the Arab world's poorest country. To make matters worse, Yemen is a country where slavery and human trafficking still exists, and numerous war crimes have been committed during the fighting. Coalitions backed by Saudi Arabia killed or injured 222 children in 2019, while they also employ child soldiers in their ranks. Slavery was officially abolished in 1962 during the first of many revolutions that would lead to the formation of the current government. But Yemen's tribal culture and ongoing crisis make it difficult to enforce the previous administration's rulings. Prison centers in Yemen are essentially torture chambers, which are also backed by Saudi and the United Arab Emirates forces. Yemen's egregious violations of women's rights has also spurred global outcry. That's the brutal history of Yemen's ongoing dirty war that's created almost a dozen different political and military groups in the region. Yemen's social unrest has been directly responsible for some of the worst international threats we've seen in recent times, like the ACAP and ISIL. With multiple countries backing different groups in the region, will Yemen gain a government that supports its citizens, or will they be ruled by some puppet government? Only time will tell. Thanks for watching, and let us know what topics you'd like to see in the comments section below. If you learned anything today, hit those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss the next Geopolitics video coming your way soon.